He stood on a bridge that felt like a mountain of steel, crested by cold wind and the smell of diesel and cordite, and believed himself safe. 11 minutes later, that belief sank with him. The vessel lay like a sleeping fortress in the fjord, a leviathan longer than a city block, armored from waterline to superstructure, nets bristling from her sides, booms and torpedo defenses strung like a girdle. Cliffs rose on either side, black and sheer, muffling the world beyond. In that narrow, frozen bowl of water she seemed immovable. Men had called her a fleet in herself, a floating anchor that tied up ships and convoys and kept entire squadrons from distant ports. For the captain, identified in some records as Sir Robert Vibert, indefinido, the logic was simple and brutal. Armor, shallow water, and a prepared harbor made the ship effectively unsinkable by conventional means. His orders and his confidence were the same thing. But confidence is an argument, not a fact. And on November 12, 1944, an argument met a machine. By then, the story of this ship had already written itself in half-failures and escalating solutions. Churchill had not been sanguine. He fretted and ordered. A towering enemy vessel could not be allowed to exist as an active threat, tying Allied resources to blockade and convoy defense. Its mere presence bled men and ships and kept hope from sailing where it might have. Attempts to neutralize the ship had been a catalogue of ingenuity and frustration. Submarine crews had crawled into metal coffins. Massed dive bomber formations had clawed at the superstructure. Special bombs had been designed and deployed. Each strike taught the attackers one lesson and left them to learn the next. If you're the sort of person who watches engineering turn the tide of war, stay with this. The way physics overruled armor here is the kind of thing that rewrites doctrine. The first great attempt to finish the job had been audacious enough to read like fiction. Tiny X-craft submarines, essentially manned torpedoes big enough to hold a crew and a massive explosive charge, were to be brought into the fjord. These were not graceful craft. They were cramped, wet, and lethal for the men who piloted them. Volunteers lowered themselves into black tubes and navigated under cruiser and destroyer patrols, squeezed past nets, and then, with surgical patience, fixed mines to the ship's hull beneath the waterline. One such attack tore a hole in the ship's underbelly. The damage was severe. The hull bent and the internal spaces were wrecked. Men had paid with their lives to dig that hole, and yet the ship did not sink. The second phase was less intimate and more theatrical. Squadrons of dive bombers swept in from above. Their machine gun fire shredded canvas and anti-aircraft crews. Their bombs sheared away turrets and splintered superstructure. Operation Tungsten, a concentrated strike, showed how air power could dislocate and maim the battleship. But the armor was designed to reject blunt force. The citadel that housed engines and magazines remained stubbornly intact. The attackers could take away the face of the beast while it kept its heart beating. Then came experimental measures and partial successes. Bombs designed to gouge and crush were tried, staging the large ordnance from remote airfields in the Arctic, flying across frozen routes returning with fuel barely clinging to tanks. All of it was a logistical fight. One earlier attack using a deep penetration bomb scored direct hits that left the ship crippled but floating. It could not at that time be counted as sunk. Each failure incrementally convinced those aboard that the rules of naval warfare still mattered. Armor defeated shapes, torpedoes could be stopped, shrapnel and fire could be endured if the vital spaces remained untouched. In the captain's rooms and damage control centers, the pattern became an assumption. If you can keep the hull intact, you keep buoyancy. If you keep buoyancy, you keep life. When the ship limped into shallower water after one strike, the captain's judgment hardened. Grounded, she would be safe. Shore would be better than the deep. The decisive shift did not come from a new tactic. It came from a new idea about what a weapon could do. The tall boy was not designed to be a bigger bomb in the old sense. It was conceived by an engineer intent on rewriting the geometry of destruction. Known in accounts as a deep penetration bomb, the tall boy was heavy, streamlined, and intended to fall like a spike. Instead of simply ricocheting off armor or detonating against plating, its purpose was to use the ground or the water itself as a medium to transmit shock. A tall boy that struck sandbank did not need to breach the hull to defeat a ship. By detonating in and under the substrate, it could disrupt the foundation that held the hull upright. 7,200 pounds of explosive in a nose-hardened aerodynamic case, dropped from great height, would gather speed and stab the Earth. If the Earth yielded, if water and sand could be forced into motion and then allowed to collapse back, the result would be structural failure from below. The tall boy's physics relied on channeling energy into an incompressible medium and letting that energy open cavities, displace support, and turn solid ground into slurry. At that point, a big ship resting on a bar was no longer supported by anything like a foundation. It would settle, twist, and be denied the buoyancy that armor could not defend. Designing a weapon like that demanded precision beyond the usual bomber run. Lancasters were stripped to their bones for range and accuracy. Their bomb sights and stabilization gear had to be tuned. Crews practiced steep and steady runs, timing the release to a second. A special aiming system, the SABS, the Stabilized Automatic Bomb Sight, gave bombers an extra edge, a device that helped correct drift and maintain a steady release point in a turbulent sky. In short, Churchill's frustration had birthed not merely heavier ordnance but an industrial, physics-driven hammer. When conventional means failed, scientists and engineers built a new tool. Yet a tool is only as good as the circumstances that admit its use. The vessel in the fjord had defenders, nets and booms to keep submarines away, anti-aircraft batteries laying down a ring of flak, smoke generators that could hide the ship behind a moving curtain of soot. And the geography itself, narrow, sheltered, lined with cliffs, could assist in dispersing blast and confusing bombers. Most crucially, the crew and the captain had seen survival under fire. They had been through assaults that destroyed turrets and killed officers. They had patched the hulls and made the ship a stronger argument for staying afloat. From their side, the solution to damage was not surrender, but a defensive repositioning. Pull into shallows, settle the hull upon the sand, and ride out the storm as a grounded fortress. What the ship's defenders could not easily see was the new dimension the tall boys introduced. A bomb that could liquefy the very ground beneath the hull subverted the calculus of armor. No amount of side plating could hold up a ship whose keel was suddenly unsupported. On the morning of the final assault, the weather courts favored the attackers. A stillness lay on the fjord. There was almost no wind to carry away smoke. Normally, an attacking run would have to fight drifting plumes and moving camouflages. This time the conditions were mercilessly favorable. Visible and distinct against the pale sky, the ship was a clear target. The smoke that should have wrapped and softened her profile hung low and dense, a trap rather than a veil. Bombers lining up from altitude peered through the same quiet air that would not betray their approach. The captain ordered the ship to be towed, to sit on a shoal as a deliberate defense. He minimized the chances of sinking in deep water and maximized his ability to control salvage and repair. "We are no longer a ship." That phrase, recorded in accounts, carried a tone of grim practicality. A vessel incapacitated and placed ashore for preservation and defense. What it did not anticipate was the new threat beneath the feet of the sea. Operation Catechism, the name given to the final concentrated strikes, unfolded with engineered cruelty. Squadrons of Lancasters, some already trained for tallboy delivery, crossed the long corridors of night and cold. They approached from altitude to build the momentum the bomb required. The first tallboy that struck did so not on armor but on the shallows beneath the hull, where sand and water met the ship's supporting seams. The explosion did not simply scatter decking, it converted solid support into moving slurry. The phrase liquefying the foundation is not metaphor here. The substrate was converted into a mixture that could not resist the mass and moment of a vessel designed to rest on solid reaction. The first detonation altered the geometry of stability. Turrets were ejected outward as if flung by an invisible hand. Compartments that had held men and machinery were crushed from below. Pressures and stresses ran along frames in ways the designers had not accounted for. Within minutes, the ship took a pronounced list. Crews fought to counter-flood and right her. They juggled pumps and bulkhead doors, and the grim arithmetic of trim and heel. But the second and third tall boys found the hull itself, punching deep into structures and, crucially, bursting near magazine spaces. Fires started, and beyond that, the integrity of the internal compartments failed. What follows in the record is a compressed interval of collapse, a window that lasted 11 minutes from the first decisive strike to the final roll. 11 minutes is not long. In that span, order turned into tactical improvisation and then into chaos. Men who had stood to man their stations faced an accelerating physics lesson. Geometry had ceased to be friendly. The ship's own weight became an instrument of destruction when the foundation no longer answered. Minute by minute, the ship's behavior was drastic. An initial list that the crew tried to counter. Engines wound and then failing. Pumps overrun by rising water and failing seals. Explosions from internal ruptures throwing men and debris across decks. The rhythm of alarms and shouted orders punctuated by the shriek of failing hydraulics. Observers described turrets rolling free like sections of a stage set, superstructure tearing away in sheets. The great bulk rotated as the support under one side collapsed first, then the other. The center of gravity shifted past rescue. Whatever had been possible in the realm of repair became impossible in the physics of a toppling mass. The captain's decision to ground the ship, made to preserve life and material, became the miscalculation that shortened survival. Grounding assumes a base to carry load. It assumes that the earth beneath will stay earth. The tall boys rewrote that assumption. In the 11 minutes after the initial strike, the vessel capsize progressed from anxious roll to irreversible tumble. It was not sudden in the cinematic sense. It was a mechanical choreography of failure, but it accelerated with a merciless clarity. Men tried to cut lines, to abandon ship, to push others into lifeboats. Rescue attempts scrambled from shore and from small boats that dared the rough wake of a collapsing giant. The sea took its toll. Casualty figures recorded in accounts present the scale with a grim arithmetic, reported as 971 dead and 87 rescued. Whether those numbers are the final, verified totals or are recorded in different sources with slight variation, the human cost was enormous. Among the dead was the captain himself, swept with his ship into the cold stillness. The imagery is stark not for its spectacle but for its sorrow. A leader who had made a defensive calculation, a vessel whose survival had been a strategic problem for years, and hundreds of men whose lives hinged on mettle and judgment. The sinking did not merely remove a single naval unit from a map. Strategically, the result was immediate and telling. The threat that had demanded convoys to be diverted, that had forced the allocation of escort vessels and aircraft, that had shaped whole theaters of strategy, was gone. Industrial engineering had imposed a new limit on traditional defense. Armor and anchoring were not invulnerable to a weapon that attacked support rather than plating. The war had in a sense matured from fleet maneuvers and armor schemes into an era where physics and manufacturing precision could decide engagement. There is an irony here that is cruel and instructive. The captain had anchored his argument in naval rule. If you keep the hull intact, the ship floats. He had seen his vessel survive bombs that shattered turrets and shredded crews. He had judged the protections, nets, booms, shallow grounding, to be decisive. He had effectively discounted the possibility that an enemy could weaponize the ground itself. That was the ignored warning. Not a single line shouted on the bridge, but the cumulative intelligence and engineering trend that suggested the ground could be transformed into a weapon. The captain's choice, arrived at under pressure and in the logic of prior experience, collided with a new domain of precision destruction. This collision between old rules and novel tools is an important lesson about how warfare evolves. Tradition and hard-won doctrine are powerful anchors for decision-making. They are born from past experience and often from survival. But when technology creates an effect that falls outside the logic those doctrines were designed for, the consequences can be rapid and catastrophic. In this case, it took 11 minutes for the mismatch to show itself decisively. A single material fact, the conversion of solid support into unstable slurry, made all prior defenses moot. We should be careful here not to romanticize the outcome as merely an engineer's triumph. The tallboy was an instrument of war that required skilled aircrew and brave mechanics to deliver it. Its effectiveness came at the cost of crews flying long missions in perilous weather, of planners who risked men and machines to achieve a particular set of conditions, and of a strategic environment that brutalized choices on both sides. The sinking that removed a strategic anchor from the map also removed nearly 1,000 human lives. The photograph of the capsized hull is not a monument to ingenuity alone. It is a ledger of loss. What remains true, though, is the broader implication. After that day, planners could not assume that grounding or traditional armor would be an impermeable defense. They had to reckon with weapons that used medium and topology as part of their destructive path. Industrial precision, heavy bombs, accurate sights, logistical reach, had translated scientific ideas into strategic leverage. The Titanic argument of invincibility had been replaced by the engineering argument of system vulnerability. The immediate human traces of the event are small and stark. The survivors pulled from the water, shivering and scarred. The rescue crews counting the living and the dead. The men on shore striking flares against the dimming sky. Bodies were moved, records taken, dispatches sent. Politicians and admirals read the tactical memo. Where you anchor matters less than the nature of the weapon aimed at you. Engineers on both sides took note. Designers read the day like a textbook problem. There is also a moral of decision-making threaded through the tale. The captain's confidence, and the decision that followed, was not a unique hubris. It was a rational choice within a set of known variables. That is the reminder. Decisions that appear obvious in hindsight were often the only reasonable options on the deck in the moment. The forgotten warning here is the invisible one. A changing technological curve that had outpaced the assumptions embedded in doctrine. The captain's fate changed in 11 minutes because the battlefield had moved into a different dimension, where mass and precision could forge new truths quicker than doctrine could adjust. For historians and strategists, the episode is a study in adaptation. For engineers, it is the proof of concept that energy delivered in the right way can be exponentially more effective than raw mass. For the sailors and officers aboard the ship, it is a sequence of decisions that meant life or death. For the world watching, it was a concrete demonstration that industrialized warfare, the mass production of novel, physics-driven weapons and the logistics to deliver them, was remaking strategic reality. In the end, we are left with a simple, grim image. A bridge of cold metal, a man who had judged his defenses sound, and the slow, mechanical unmaking of a floating fortress in less than a quarter of an hour. The captain's ignored warning was not a single voice shouted and unheard. It was the unheeded implication of a changing age, that foundations themselves could become the target. 11 minutes was all it took for that new physics to make a decision final. If you found this exploration of engineering and tactics revealing, consider subscribing to follow deeper looks at how technology reshaped key battles and decisions in history. The wreck's silence in the years after has been a lecture to navies and designers. Anchoring a ship in geography is a choice about risk, not its elimination. Armor is protection only against certain vectors of force. New weapons can attack assumptions rather than surfaces. In the fjord on that cold day, a captain chose to trust an old calculus. A new kind of bomb obliged him to confront its limits. The cost was measured in human lives and in a concise interval of collapse. 11 minutes that changed a fate and signaled a larger shift in the science of war.